With my lights placed in the streetlights, in this video I'll look at some additional properties in the shadows to fine-tune the look. What I've done here is take some of my photometric lights and clone them, naming them Streetlight 001 and so forth. I've sized the rectangle in the Shape Area Shadows section to fit the streetlight, as there's a small recessed area at the head where these fit in. I've also made sure that these are, well, decently sized, and for the moment shadows aren't on. They're functioning as a spotlight, and the hot spot and fall off are wherever they were. I'll try a quick test render and see how this looks, hitting F9 or render production. It looks like I'm still working on a region render, and so I can hit escape, get out of this, and change back over to a view, as I want to see the overlap of these lights. So far it's looking pretty decent in the section that I can see. I'm getting a good bloom here from the streetlight, which maybe could be a little bit brighter given the lights outside here, the buildings here, but it's not bad. I may want to turn on some shadows. Of particular concern are also the deep black shadows being cast by my sun. Shadows are, yes, dark, but rarely dead black, rarely that deep, and so we have some controls we need to play with to both lighten the shadows and see if we can get away with shadow maps in places to add a little bit of lift and softness to the scene and speed up the render. Remember, this is a 1280 by 720 frame, and we're going to end up with possibly hundreds of these in an animation. At 24 frames a second or even 30, those add up really quick. My render is done, and now I'll look at some shadow properties and making those lights really pop out. First, since I have the lights selected, I need to play with the hotspot and fall off a little bit here. I'm going to bring the hotspot for these lights up to 45 and the fall off up to 85. That way I've got a little more reach on that light. We can see here that that light now has a greater spread out and should give me a little more power. I'm also going to bring up in here the candle power, bumping it up to, let's say, 2000, so they're a little bit brighter. We can also change the color of these lights so it looks better in the render. For example, instead of a D65 reference white, I may want to choose something like a mercury or a sodium for a different look. I'll try, for example, in here, a ceramic metal halide that's cool, and see what the difference is. It's okay to color your lighting, and to really get it looking like the lighting you want. Notice again I'm going to run a region, and see how this behaves. Before I hit render though, I'll try one other thing. I'll hit escape, and make sure that I turn on ray trace shadows. The big deal is I can push down a lot of time in rendering, and so it's important to test this thoroughly, and if I need to multiply tests together or compound them, I should. So I'll turn on my ray trace shadows and see how this looks in that region, hitting F9 to render. I can see already this is nicer looking. Instead of being a stark white in the streetlight, it's got a, well, streetlight orange going. And it really has a good contrast next to that white outside the lobby. And I'm getting my shadows spreading out from the streetlight and from the sun, and I like the way it's looking. These will add some extra lap shadows in here by the bus stop too, and even a little bit of shadow off the curb to ground it. Terrific. Now for those dark shadows from the sun, and I'll hit escape to get out of that rendering. I'll pick my sun. In this case, I'll just work from name. It may seem like a trivial issue, but sometimes what I'll do is work by name and not have to navigate around the view in the camera to find where I am. I'll turn on all of my objects here, and I should be able to go find that sunlight. It's called Direct Light 001, and there's its target. While I'm at it, I'll rename this to Sun, so I can find it more easily. It's got ray trace shadows, and I'll go down and look at the shadow parameters. In here, in the shadow parameters for standard lights then, we've got a shadow color and a density. I'm going to leave my shadows, well, black for now, but I'm going to lower back that density, maybe to 0.75, and see how this looks. I'll run another region and see what I get. That's better. Especially in this outside render where I'm not using my bounce light, I can really see a difference here. That lowering down the density of those shadows takes it from really heavy black to fairly dark. Still definitely in shadow, but not completely oppressive and lacking range. Maybe I'll boost this up just a little bit. Instead of 0.75, I'll try 0.85, but I'll add in a little bit of contrast. As a lot of my scene has warm tones, into the shadows and their color, I'm going to bring in a little bit of indigo by pushing up the blue, pulling down the saturation, and backing off that value till it's almost dark. I can even bring this down a little further. Now it may seem like a very tiny difference here, a value of 1 or 2 and a little bit of blue, but that's going to add a subtle cast to those shadows that gives me something different than black. I'll test again. There's just the tiniest bit of purple going on in contrast to that warmth, and I like the way it looks. Right here we can really see it on the column. The littlest bit of indigo or blue in there, and the warm column in the light. We have other properties available if we'd like to play with shadow maps as well. Before I finish though, I'll look at my ray trace shadow parameters. If we need a greater tracing depth, we've got the ability to do it. And if you'd like to experiment with things like glass, you may be playing with it. The ray bias does change where those rays start a little bit if you need to push the shadow. But being that ray trace shadows are calculated accurately, there's really not a lot of things going on in here to play with. It's more about the look of the shadow here in the shadow parameters. Picking one of my uplights on the other buildings shows the same kind of thing. I'll change this over though to shadow maps and see what I can do with it. I'll pull this up, and here's my shadow parameters just the same as the others. There's a density and a color, so I'll start by backing off that density to maybe 0.9. Then I'll look at the shadow map parameters. And what we can deal with here in our shadow maps is the size of the map, the accuracy at which it's drawn, and also a bias and a sample range. I'll pull in a little bit, try a quick render, and see what I need to do with it. Okay, here's my quick render, and I can see some obvious issues. Right here in the bottom left on the render, there's a bright spot and then a shadow band across the building. I've got shadow maps on these free spots, and I'll scroll down again, and there's my shadow parameters, which I've backed off to 0.9 for a little less density. Then I'll look in the shadow maps, and what I can do in here is first up the size, making these draw at, let's say, 1024, so there's a higher resolution in the shadows and greater detail. I can also pull back the bias in my shadow maps, which pushes the shadow forward and backward from its starting point. I'll try a bias of 0.2 and see how this looks. I'll even edit that region. I know how this part looks, and really what I'm concerned about is down there. That's a little better. With a lower bias, I get a good fast shadow. Lots of shading going on in the building here. I'll broaden out this region and see if it holds up everywhere else. What I'm looking for then is that the shadows start roughly in the right place and fuzz out, preserving the detail and not being overly dense. That's much better. I've got a bright panel, a dark panel, a fairly accurate shadow, and it stops in the right place, whereas this one bleeds off and gets nice and fuzzy. The size is getting me a better quality or accuracy to it, and I've got more drama in the lighting. I'll back out this render just a little bit and try one more full screen, and that should pretty well do it on my shadows. I can add in other shadows if I've needed, and see if there's anything else to play with here in the lighting, maybe a few more lights here and there. Here's that full screen render, and I like the way it's looking. I've got good deep shadows going on, but not entirely black on the buildings from the sun. Nice shadows in multiple directions from my light poles, grounding them, and light and shadow playing on the surface of the building here, and letting it recede up into black up in the top. It's working well, and I'm ready for any final polish on the lighting, mixing up the shadows and playing with their parameters so they're not fully black and fully dense, getting the look I want across here, and economizing my render time.